Okay, so we'll continue talking about the development of rhetoric. So, as I told you, maybe in advance, this course will have a historical profile, and the book, if you started to read it, who has started to read the book? Two people.
Which one?
It's a good. Which you don't even know what to do.
No, I'm reading
What do you
many
think?
simultaneously.
Guess what could the course book be?
Yeah, of course that one.
What is it?
Sorry.
And maybe you should look. It's a book by a guy called Kennedy,
Yeah.
right? And it's very historical. And my lectures, as I've told you before, are actually basically built on this book with a few extras. And last time we talked about the development of rhetoric in animals, and we looked at some still existing today primitive societies, even though they are disappearing fairly quickly. Today we're going to look at the first civilizations, and the oldest civilization in the sense of having people who are not just walking around as hunters and gatherers, but settling down. Where is that? Communication. Master students in communication should know something about history, Carlos.
Well, Mesopotamia most
Very good, Carlos. Excellent. That's it.
And you came back from the dead.
Yeah. Okay, so we start with the so-called ancient Near East, and by the ancient Near East we mean Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Israel. So those of you who are Chinese who might have thought that China is the oldest, no, it's not. Mesopotamia is the oldest. Mesopotamia means between the rivers. Okay, Mesopotamia means rivers. So this is the country where today, well, which country is basically in Mesopotamia?
Turkey. No. Okay.
If you had gone back 200 years, you would have been correct.
No, so yeah, I know.
But not today.
It's between Efrat and.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. And what's the country called? Geography is also important.
It's Iraq. Yeah. Is it Iraq or?
Iraq.
Yeah.
Iraq, yes, Iraq. Okay, so in any case, that's where we believe that human beings first started to settle down. They discovered the art of agriculture. And that's also the place where it seems that writing first developed. And the oldest language with a system of writing seems to be this language, Sumerian. And after that, after a few thousand years, it was replaced by another language in the same place called Akkadian. That language, Akkadian, is a Semitic language. In other words, it's a predecessor of Arabic and Hebrew, etc. This language is not Semitic. It's its own language family. So, Sumerian writing developed before 3000 BC. We are not yet 3000 AD, okay? So if you know where the year 0 is, then it's a long time ago. So it's more than 5,000 years ago. Okay, why did they develop writing? What is the origins of writing? Well, here are some things. They wanted to mark things, ownership. They would have a certain symbol showing, my clan, my family. We own these sheep. We own this. Various things. They had trading, and they wanted to say, okay, I'm giving you 15 sheep, and I want 15 clay vessels of grain back. So then they would develop some kind of marks for counting, and things like that. And one thing led to another. So starting with ownership, commerce, etc., you find that after, it didn't go that quickly, but let's say after a few thousand years, it's a long time, right, or 1,000 years, they are beginning to be able to write historical, religious, legal, and even literary texts. What did they write on? How do we know this? If they had written on paper, it would have disappeared.
And they write on stones and something.
No, they did not write on stone.
Or
The Vikings did.
And leather and something.
No. Actually, if you read here, it says clay. Clay and wax. Clay. This is the thing. The Babylonians and the Sumerians had lots of clay. That's what they built their houses, and they had it sun-dried. And then they discovered a way of marking things on clay. And they used a little sharp instrument which has a sharp edge. So if you look at the letters, they're all pretty jagged. That type of writing is called cuneiform writing. Cuneiform, okay, what's that word? And beginning, it was small pictures. It's natural to start that way. When you look at Chinese characters, you know it started the same way, small pictures. Also here, so it's called pictograph. Seals, that's more the ownership, identification seals, etc. After a while, they started to use the signs not only for the pictures, but also for the sound of the words which referred to whatever the picture was of. That's actually the same development you will later see in Egyptian hieroglyphs and in Chinese characters. So, Chinese characters, you can actually write any Western name if you don't worry about the meaning of the characters, right? Yeah, that's exactly the same here. That's what they started to do. So the picture started to get less important and the sound started to get more important. So you find the same development actually in here, Babylonia, Sumeria, Egypt and China later on. So this system of writing then went from the Sumerians to the Akkadians who spoke, so this is here, it crosses between two very different languages. They're not related. From the Akkadians, it goes to the Phoenicians. And from the Akkadians and Phoenicians to Hebrew. These are still Semitic languages, right? But then, it crosses from the Phoenicians to the Greeks. And now we have left Semitic writing systems. Semitic writing systems, they don't usually worry too much about the syllables or about the vowels. It's basically often very... In the beginning, these systems were usually syllabic. They're based on syllables. And after a while, they develop either to a system where you have only consonants and you don't care so much about the vowels. That's like Arabic and Hebrew. Or you have a system where you have equal weight for consonants and vowels. That's Greek and Latin. And we, of course, this is Latin, Roman. That's the system that you today find in all of the, Western, Europe basically, and America. The Russians have a variant on Greek. Does anyone know how to read Russian? Yeah, so you know. There are a few. Russian is sort of in between Roman and Greek, you might say. Cyrillic alphabet. Okay, but not only that, but you also find that this old system had an influence on the Indian way of writing, which is another very big writing system in terms of how many languages and how many people use it. It's called Devanagari. This one, you don't usually pronounce it, you say Devanagari, but it's spelled Devanagari, but it's pronounced Devanagari. That's what Hindi, Sanskrit, and then from Sanskrit, Hindi, Bengali, a lot of languages are inspired by this kind of writing. Okay, so this is an old civilization, and it was basically, the Sumerians were organized in city-states. They lived in this Mesopotamia between the rivers, between Euphrates and Tigris. And it's of this area sometimes also called the Fertile Crescent, because it was very good. Today it perhaps isn't. I think today it's more desert-like, but in those days it was very easy to grow things there. Very fertile ground. So this area was one of the best in the world to start agriculture. And so these people went from being hunter-gatherers to being agriculturalists, pastoralists, having sheep. They started irrigation, and they started to build cities. In the beginning they were democratic. After a while it seems that they become much less democratic, and they had autocratic kings. They started to, when they had started to develop writing, they also started to have professional scribes trained in schools. The way you trained was to imitate other people, and they also actually had some exercise in how to develop some topic in writing. Writing had very high status in this culture, higher than speech. They were like the first in the world to have writing, and they thought it was a great skill. They did not, as you see here, orators are not honored, and they have warnings in text against unnecessary, thoughtless speech. So here you see, writing has a high value. Now, I want you to think about this question. What are the effects of the development of writing on rhetoric? Now you can talk to your neighbor and we'll hear what you come up with. Share some of your thoughts. Who wants to start? How about the lonely gentleman on the last bench?
Yeah. Well, actually, I think one of the biggest effects was if you take from the beginning of everything since the prehistoric age when they were just writing pictures. I mean, you could, the first time when as writing was being developed and advanced, you could put your own thoughts in it. I mean, your intentions were much easier to interpret. You could say much more, influence more.
So you think it's an aid to memory?
Sorry?
You're supposed to think about the influence on rhetoric.
Yeah, but it's the
Not
way
in general.
Yeah, but it's the way you could say it. I mean, the
Yeah,
way you can influence, the way you can manipulate pathos and logos and all those elements as developed.
Easier to plan and structure if you have it on paper or on
Yeah,
tape.
but if the writing is advanced compared to if it's not, all those elements it cannot be easily manipulated if the writing is primitive.
Right. So maybe it didn't have that kind of influence at once.
Exactly. So the biggest influence would be in the manipulation of the element of pathos, logos, pathos. I mean,
Later on.
later on.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody? What did you come to? Yeah.
We were thinking that maybe the style has been more to the point because there was not enough space to just write everything that you are talking about.
So they learned to have just some keywords to speak from as a memory list? Is that
No, not as a memory list, but they have learned how to effectivize the communication. Maybe how they want to write.
They became more conscious of what it is they're doing when they are
Yes,
communicating.
and eliminate the unnecessary.
The writing has an effect on your awareness of the medium of communication, language.
Yeah.
So you
Though
have a
we were
kind of-
thinking specifically for that culture, obviously.
Yeah, maybe I think it's not too far-fetched to make it as a general claim.
We had a second one. We were thinking
Yeah.
that basically what Alan said regarding being able to prepare, but this then the speaker or whoever was. They would probably be able to also grade their different arguments, and this gave more or less a start to a disposition.
Yeah,
Because
so, so they become more aware again of language and they can
Yes.
structure.
Exactly, language enables them to plan and memorize and to structure the speech, and this means that they will start trying different dispositions, because some arguments are better than others, some arguments need to be spoken before other arguments, and so on and so on.
Yeah, so
They started to build up, and the rhetoric has been more developed. By the
sometimes
help of-
the terms meta-linguistic, meta-communicative awareness is given a great boost. Yeah, do you have any thoughts?
I think because of writing skills,
Yeah.
the logics and pathos is more developed.
Pathos.
Yeah, that
Really?
was pathos. It's all thing is
Pathos is emotions.
Yeah,
Why would that develop more
But-
with writing?
but they can develop the skills that way to
Yeah.
educate and debate or some.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
basically
By the
same.
way, some place.
They become more conscious of the use of language and so on. And, yeah. What did you have?
Well, it also allowed people to preserve their arguments. Once they were, if they were just spoken, they would disappear after
Right.
they were uttered.
So there's a kind of collective memory being created. So you can see what you can learn from earlier generations. Okay, let's see what I had thought of. So I had some more general reflections also. Writing created a new social class of scribes. This is the background for intellectuals, you might say. Writers, readers, thinkers, in the long run academics, as we have today. There was a standardization which was made possible, and this comes out in the Babylonian code of laws. Have you heard about the laws of Hammurabi? Yeah. So that was made possible, I think, through the invention of writing. So they had laws and regulations, which in turn made possible also large-scale government. So in the beginning, the Sumerian cities were city-states. But after a while, they were sort of conquered by one power. By the time we get to Akkadian, we now have the Assyrian Empire. And have you heard of these things, right? And eventually you had the Persian Empire and so on. They were all in this part of the world. So we had Babylonian, Assyrian, all of these so-called empires, Persian, Greek, Roman. They all relied to a large extent on having writing to be able to send detailed instructions by runners or riders to four areas in the empire. Okay, and then we have this that some of you came up with, the externalization of thought in writing. Reification, that means you make your thoughts less fluid, they are reified, they stay in a certain shape on the paper. And standardization. And this made possible, and we already discussed this, new kinds of concepts, meta-linguistic, meta-communicative concepts, meta-rhetorical. This is the kind, these concepts, ethos, pathos, they're all examples of the conceptualizing communication. But also things like mathematical concepts. So maybe you know that the Assyrians and the Babylonians were actually very good at mathematics. They had a 12-based system. They were very advanced in astronomy. And this would probably not have been possible unless they had also had a system of writing. And in general, they became better at logical reasoning, looking for causes and effects, etc. Effects of writing on rhetoric, easier to become aware of rhetorical structure, and we had that. And we also had this one, study of past speeches. So we could preserve patterns which have already come up earlier. Okay, what were the types of rhetoric then? Well, in general, there are these three. Deliberative, where you try to convince people of some course of action, and that was common when they had city-states. Became slightly less common when they got autocratic rulers. Judicial, where you judge what people have done in the past, and you perhaps it's come to a judgment and sometimes punishments or rewards. This was also more common in the beginning when they had city-states, but to some extent it continued also under the autocratic rulers. And then epideictic, which is neither towards the future nor the past, but more in the present, where you are promoting some sense of social togetherness. What we find there is so-called praise poetry. And that's where poets come up and sing the praise of a ruler. And they say all the positive things that the ruler is supposed to be doing. Okay. What kind of style, what kind of elocutio did they have? Well, they tried things like parallelism and repetition, so that you repeat the same kind of words. they used archaic forms of language. That's common in many of these ancient. They go even further back in history. They are already far back in history, but they try to find even older forms of language, which only exists in this writing. But it gives it a kind of special and sacred character. The poetic form is praise, laments, and epic myths, and there's a lot of respectful address to kings and gods. There is some metaphor in the poetry, and in this culture, Sumerian, Babylonian, they actually did distinguish similes from metaphors. And as perhaps you remember last time we discussed that in the Australian Aboriginal poetry, they did not do that. They had a more direct identification with nature and animals. But here, they have both, he is a lion and he is like a lion. Okay, here is the identification metaphor, and here is the simile, making explicit the comparison. Means of persuasion. Well, you can see here, they're not, well, here we have the king of Uruk, who is writing a letter on clay sent by an ambassador to the king of Aratta. Okay? And he wants the king of Aratta to be subordinate. Okay? And if he does not agree to comply with the demands of the king of Uruk, then he tells him what will happen. You will get no food, they will stop all the grain and so on being delivered to the city, and there will be violence and destruction of your city. Okay, so this is using a means of persuasion that in classical rhetoric is called, you remember? Ad baculam, to the stick. That basically is a threat, right? That's what they're. You don't do what I tell you, we're going to do bad things to you. Okay, so that is not, I mean, you would maybe expect that in early types of rhetoric. Well, you probably find it still today. I don't know, I haven't seen any of the letters written by the United States to Putin, but I would guess that they have some threats in them. I don't know. Or by Putin to the government of the Ukraine. I don't know. Okay, there is a very well-known poem written by the old Sumerians. Have you heard about the Gilgamesh poem? Yeah, it's maybe one of the first poems in world history. And it's really about one of the kings of Uruk. Uruk was a very important Sumerian city, and it's about him. And in this poem, you find arguments between the gods of the Sumerians, you find probabilistic arguments, you find laments. So it's like the beginning of a lot of things you will see later on in many types of literature. If you look at the letters that they were writing, all means of persuasion actually, ethos, pathos, and logos are all used, and there are sometimes probabilistic arguments. So this is supposed to show that they were actually fairly advanced. Some people, sometimes people argue, how much have we human beings, how much more advanced are we than they were 5,000 or 6,000 years ago? Are we more advanced, or are we not? Do we just have a lot more things, and do we think more or less the same thing?
More or less the same thing, but different in some aspects only.
Maybe. I don't know.
We have built up on technology and everything, but
so
if
the
we
big
go
difference
without
is technology, not our ability to think.
Yes, of course. We have built up on that too.
Of course, I mean there.
Yeah, but we are more aware of other possibilities now, maybe.
Yes.
Other ways of thinking, but we would not necessarily think
Is our
that way
language-
if we were in the same situation as they are.
Is our language more advanced than theirs?
I'm not sure.
I mean, there is an argument. There is an argument to say that it is, because we have had time to develop a lot more refined concepts about language, communication, rhetoric, about thinking, and so on, which they didn't actually have in their language. And that's making it easier for us to think about these things than it was for them. But personally, I think it's a matter of degree. It's not a categorical difference, but we do have a lot more means at our disposal than they have. And that's the main reason for why we are perhaps in some ways more advanced or more complex anyway. Okay, so here is we talked before that they could structure things. So here is an example. They're writing a letter to Egypt, and they're writing in the new diplomatic language, which was Akkadian. This had replaced Sumerian. So there are some things you can note. If they write the writer's name first, that means that they think that the sender is more superior than the addressee. If they write the addressee's name first, that means that they think they're writing to somebody who is above them. So this was a convention that they had. And so it starts with an address, with this order, where you take the most important person first, and then you also say who's writing it. Then they have some kind of greeting, salutation, and then they say something like, this is what you still find people writing. I know you fine. This seems to be a not too original way of writing letters. And you wish then the other person, well, you think everything is well with you. So after they've gone through this, then they come to the main point of the letter. And here is where they say that, well, you should have good relations. They present some problem, complaint. Often these letters are actually about marriages. They suggest that they have a daughter or a son who should marry the daughter or the son of the other party. This was a very common way to cement diplomatic relations. And they would also have sometimes gifts, and sometimes they would have complaint. In these days, they seem to have had diplomatic representatives. So Egyptians were in Babylon, and there were Babylonians in Egypt. And sometimes these people were not treated nicely, and now they write letters where they complain about things like that. The end of these letters is very abrupt. So you know already here in the beginning who's writing, so you don't really need to write that at the end. And that's a difference from the kind of letters we have now. What you find at the end is sometimes a note from one scribe to another, where they might write something like, write the next letter in Hittite. So Hittite was another language which was used as a kind of diplomatic language. The Hittites were a dominant group in what is now East Turkey. And they had conquered a lot of the area too, and they were sometimes at war with Babylon and sometimes with Egypt. Okay, now let's leave Babylon and go to Egypt. In Egypt, sometimes historians divide. This is like history before the, let's say before the year 500 BC. Or BCE is another way of writing BC. BC means before Christ. BCE means before the Common Era. Okay, that's if you want to try to hide that actually it's a Christian idea. then you write it like that. Okay. So there's the Old Kingdom from 2686 to 2000, so it's about 500 years. Middle Kingdom, another 500 years, and then you have the New Kingdom. And after this, there are various pharaohs going on, and the whole thing ends, as you might know, by Alexander the Great capturing Egypt around the 300 BC. And when he dies, one of his generals takes over, and his family name is Ptolemaios. And then you have the Ptolemaic order of pharaohs, and they are the people who ruled Egypt until Cleopatra. You heard about her, and she seduces Julius Caesar and Antony and so on, and then the Romans take over. Yeah, that's basic. Okay, so a general fact about Egypt is that they were more appreciative of oral eloquence than in Mesopotamia. So they appreciated rhetoric in the sense we think of it, oral presentation. The ruler of Egypt was called a pharaoh, and so this was an autocratic society, and he was helped by his priests, and there was not much, no democratic assemblies or any of that sort. They had schools which were training scribes, merchants, and civil servants. The writing has the same kind of story as the cuneiform writing. It starts with pictures, and it develops over the ages into a more phonetic, and it becomes also more simplified. It's like Chinese characters. The first characters are much more complicated, and over the years they become simpler. It's the same here. Have you all seen Egyptian hieroglyphs? No?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, so here are some interesting Egyptian rhetorical texts. One is called the Eloquent Peasant. This is from the period of the Middle Kingdom. So it's 2055, 1650 BC. Combines ordinary prose and formal language. It's about a peasant who wins arguments by using maxims resembling proverbs. So he's like talking to, I don't know, to Pharaoh or somebody. And so he says, life sustainer, let not die. Okay, so Pharaoh presumably is the life sustainer. So he is so generous, and therefore he must not let whatever it is die. So he used it, and these were commonly known proverbial ways of talking. So if you use those, you could have success when you're talking to a ruler. Or here's another one: shade, let no one dry out. So I guess the pharaoh is supposed to provide shade or protection from the sun, and because of that, the water will not dry out. And the water probably is the life of something. These speeches often, topos means what are the topics? What are they discussing? What's the content? It's very often about warning rulers to stay on the right line. They have to have proper functions, and if they don't do those proper functions, then the Nile, in the Nile each year, they have this flood. It flows over the edges, and when it goes back, you have fertile earth. And they believe that the pharaoh had an essential function here. If he did not do his stuff right, then the Nile wouldn't flood the right way, etc. So they believe that the pharaoh was a kind of god who had to do the right things.
Yeah, and they believe that they should throw beautiful girls to the river so that God will do.
Yeah, they had some ideas like that too. Yes. Maybe he was trying to save the life of one of those girls here. Life sustainer, let not die. Who knows? I don't know. Okay, here's another one. The instruction of Ptah-hotep. He was a vizier or minister to the pharaoh, and he's giving advice to his son about how the son should act in order to have success. And usually, if you look at some of the rhetorical terms there, how do you gain ethos in this culture? Well, by the position you have. If you are a minister, if you are a priest, then by the fact that you are this kind of person, you are trustworthy. So you don't need to do so much extra. That's sort of given by your status. Yeah?
So they don't ever have to do anything to develop their ethos because they have only situated ethos.
Yes.
Or okay, that's
Ever maybe is a strong word, but basically they can rely on that. They're given authority by their position. And we won't find very developed ethos. Well, we'll get to China today, but we'll find later on the ones who really developed this are going to be the Greeks. But we don't find it so much here. But anyway, it's interesting to see what advice is this person giving to his son 2000 BC. Keep silent is a good idea sometimes. The rhetorics of silence. It's not always a good idea to talk. Maybe you can win more by just being silent. Wait for the right moment to speak. This is kairos, okay? Restrain passionate words.
Wow.
When you know this thing about when you get an email and you get angry, or you get something, good idea, don't send the email the same day, wait until the next day and then change some of the words. This is still good advice, I think. Speaking fluently, but with deliberation. So you should plan a little what you should say. You should not just blabber on. Keep your tongue with your heart, so you speak the truth. So here is a moralistic, you should not lie. This is advice then from the minister to his son. What kind of things should you, what kind of arguments? Well, he recommends conformity to social norms, obedience, listening to others, patience, goodwill, forbearance, and cheerfulness, even in difficulty. This is the way you should talk and see. Doesn't seem too unlike what one might see today, I don't know. Debate. We don't find any full syllogisms of the way that was later developed by the Greeks. It's mostly enthymemes, and if you remember the term enthymeme, it means a kind of conventional argument which a lot of people use, and because a lot of people use it, you think it's correct, and it's not basically, strictly speaking, it's not valid, but it carries weight because it's common. And so you find many of those kind of arguments. There was a brief period when there was one pharaoh, Akhenaton, who tried to change the religion of Egypt quite radically. Do you know about this? Before him, they worshipped a god called Ammon. Actually, this guy's name, when he was born and given his name, was Eknamon, I think. But he became convinced that there should only be one God, like the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians, one God. He was first. So for him, the God was the sun, and Aton is the sun god. So he wanted, because the other Egyptians were all polytheistic, but he wanted to have only one God, namely the sun. And when he wanted to introduce this, he actually had some kind of propaganda, which we can still see, where he's trying to make this view the right one and so on. But most of his propaganda texts, if you want to call it that, were actually destroyed then when he died by people who wanted to go back to the old
by the clergy.
Yeah. So maybe you've heard of his son. His son they found a grave in the 1920s, Tutankhamun. Okay, Tutankhamun was not originally called Tutankhamun, but Tutankhaton. But just as his father had changed his name from Eknamon to Eknaton, now the son had to change from Tutankhaton to Tutankhamun. Okay, now we get to the Hebrews. They are also important for rhetoric, since they have dominated both Christianity and Islam with their Bible, not to speak themselves, but they have been very important for ideas of rhetoric. The Bible shows Sumerian, Akkadian, and Egyptian influence. The Jews attached a lot of importance to words. If you read the Bible, you'll see, in the beginning was a word. This makes any linguist's heart it feels good. Words are important. Okay, so God created the world by speaking and naming. If you go to Chinese tradition, there's a contrast. Confucius says, heaven does not speak. Seems that the Chinese, and we have some Chinese on the last bench, you are not so interested in words as the Westerns are, perhaps. Yeah. The book of Proverbs in the Bible is especially relevant to rhetoric. In that you find warnings against misuse of speech. They go against scoffers, gossips, lie, and false witness. So they want truthful speech in various ways. They retain the 5 Egyptian canons, so that shows that there was some kind of influence between Egypt and Israel. So here we have, remember these 5 canons? This is the advice from father to son. And these are retained, but they're not worded exactly the same way, so they will say, a man of understanding remains silent. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So that's the warning against too passionate words. So it goes on like that. But they have an extra canon, which the Egyptians did not have. And it's this one. God will provide the right words when they are needed. So basically you don't have to worry about it. Because when you stand there and you have to give your speech, you get your words from God. You think they're right?
I wonder if they were using that to be able to get extra power before they start to speak or something.
I think so.
Perhaps.
Just, God will help me anyway, so I can relax.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
If you are really, doing the work of God, then God will help you.
Yes.
So if He's not helping you, that shows you that you're not doing the work of God. Yeah. They valued a kind of pleasant style, which they had a term for, honeyed. So style which was full of honey, like that. Some of their metaphors comes from their experience of sheep herding. They were pastoralists. So that, for example, this one is still used in Christianity a lot. The Lord is my shepherd. You know about that? Christian religion. We talk about God as the big shepherd. We are all sheep. You don't know this? If you're Christian, you know this. But if you're not Christian, you've never heard this, perhaps. We go around being willing to be called sheep. Yeah. And they have use of parallelism, anaphora, simile, rhetorical questions. All of this you find in the Bible, the Old Testament. Means of persuasion. Well, there are lots of prophets in the Old Testament. And they, of course, they have to persuade people. So how could they persuade people that they were trustworthy? Well, they had to try to make them believe that they were spokesmen of God. They were speaking directly with God's words. So you will see in the Old Testament how they try to do that. And so they also use this kind of enthemes. What they do is they have a certain claim, an injunction, and then they come with some reason for that. So here is an example of this. This is the first commandment. In the Christian Jewish Bible there are 10 commandments. Okay, the first one is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. So why should we believe this? So they give a reason. Here's the reason. God brought you out of the house of bondage. You know what that refers to?
Slavery.
Yeah, where?
Egypt.
Egypt, according to the tradition, right? They were brought out of Egypt. Yeah. So this is sometimes called covenant speech, because they believed that there was a special covenant, union, between the Jews and God, right? The Hebrews are the chosen people. So they often try to, they use that. So this is actually, again, why should we have no other gods before me? Well, the reason is that we are these special people, so we have to. This doesn't follow logically at all. So here, that's why this is an example of an enthemy. There's no logic. One doesn't lead to the other, really. But people speak that way, so perhaps it's convincing. Probably was convincing. Okay, so often they have this kind of, they remind people of something God has done. They add a new commandment, and then they give a warning, often. If you don't disobey this, then God will be angry, and if you are obeying it, God will be pleased. So something like that. It's also interesting to speculate a little on the Hebrew language. So see, one word which is very important for rhetoric is the word persuade. So you sometimes define rhetoric as the art of persuasion. Hebrew, at least not Old Hebrew, did not have a word for the verb persuade. So if you say, I persuaded him to go to the movies or whatever, you cannot really say that. You have to translate it in another way. So it seems that the closest word is pata, which means to entice, seduce, or deceive, which is not exactly the same as persuade, right? Or if you want a more positive word, you have to use something like hear, listen, or pay attention.
Is it because they believe in free will and you cannot just persuade another person?
Perhaps it might lead to that. So what I wrote here is responsibility on the recipient. That's compatible with what you're saying. That I try get you to listen and then you make up your own mind. So it's more your responsibility if you follow my advice than it's... If I say I have to persuade you, I have to do the work.
Yeah.
But if I'm trying just to get you to listen, you have to do some of the work whether you can really accept what I'm saying. Yeah, so the Bible in general is a long succession of additions with comments. Have you seen the Jewish Bible? Have you seen how they write comments on comments on comments? It's sort of like when you look at a homepage with links, you know. The Jewish Bible is full of that. Comments on comments on comments. And it's a very rich source of rhetorical figures. It has had a great influence on Western rhetoric. Maybe it's the most influential work of all, because so many people were listening to religious preachings in churches and so on. So when you look at any of the European languages, they're full of biblical metaphors of various types. Okay, let's have a little break now, and after break we'll look a little at China.
Väldigt, neoliberalt förslag, som till exempel EMF.
So now we're going to go to China.
Så som man
China and Korea.
är sämre i ett land där det inte är någon neoliberalt.
You too, right?
Yes,
Yes.
China.
Yes.
Inom alltså förvaltningen.
Okay, so China starts out as many small agricultural villages, and around 3000 BCE you get cities, and eventually these cities start to conquer each other, so you get some dynasties. And one of the earliest dynasties is the Zhou Dynasty, 1040, 221. Yeah, this one is very well known. Qin Dynasty. It's very short, but it's very well known. Why is it well known? Because the guy who was the emperor, he built the big Chinese wall, and he also had the first bonfire with books. He wanted to get rid of everybody who did not think the same way as he did. So he burned a lot of books.
Walls, burning books.
What?
Walls and burning books.
Yes,
There's
Coming back, right?
yeah.
Yes. We've seen walls and burning books also in the past 100 years several times. So it's not in, maybe he's the first guy to think of it, but the idea has come back many times. Then we have the Han Dynasty, which is also, well, it lasted for 400 years. So now we've only come up to 220 after Christ. Okay? That's the period we're going to cover here now. It's from the oldest times until 200 AD. The oldest Chinese writing is from between 3000 and 2000. You can see that this is it's a little younger than the Sumerian and the Egyptian. But you might say that China is about number 3. If you look at how old things are. But of course, Chinese writing developed probably independently. Well, we don't really know, but it seems like it developed independently. The same way as the cuneiform and the hieroglyphs. So it starts with pictures, and pictures become simplified. So we find pictograms, bones, bronze vessels. We find omens, prophecies, and around 600 before Christ we find some poetry and philosophy. Actually, it's a very strange period around 6500. in India, in China, and in Greece. In these three places you find a lot of philosophy and poetry coming at that time. Exactly why nobody really knows. So here's a question to you that I want you to start off with thinking a little about. Is rhetoric in the Near East and China, I misspelled China there, similar or different? Can you predict any similarities or differences? Think about this before we start. Okay, let's see what you come up with. What do you think?
We think it could be similar
More similar than different.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. If it's different, did you think of any differences?
Actually, we couldn't remember any differences, but we find a lot of similarities.
Like what would be a similarity then?
High board distance.
High power distance?
Yes. And also.
So autocratic.
Collectivistic also.
Huh?
They are
Collectivistic? We don't know about the Sumerians and the Egyptians. Maybe the Egyptians were collectivist. I don't know about the Sumerians.
Yes, and also high context. Like,
Were the Egyptians and the Sumerians high context?
I think so because they use a lot of metaphors, and it's like when they, for example, in Gilgamesh,
Yeah.
he used a lot of metaphors, and you cannot understand the text without having good knowledge about what he's talking about.
Okay, could be. Might be, you're right. I think you're right about the Chinese, but I don't know about the Assyrians and the Egyptians. But we'll come to that. I think that's a very important point about China, actually. Yeah, and what did you come to?
We were thinking that they both used pictograms, or
Yeah.
so therefore rhetoric should be, at least logically, should have a lot of metaphors, things like that, similes.
Using pictograms gets you thinking metaphorically.
Yes.
To use pictures to capture things.
Yes.
Yeah, could be. Yeah.
We were also thinking about some differences
Yeah. What?
in terms of, because I don't know if I'm wrong, but writing and culture, how it spreads,
Yeah.
it's a lot of times it is a top-down affair.
Yeah.
It comes first to the aristocrats and then spreads to the people.
Yeah. Especially if you have wars and you conquer other countries, it goes
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
But what if you have commerce, so you have more trading relations?
Well,
Yeah.
this is the thing, because in China the emperor was very restricted regarding what sort of knowledge would seep down to other people. I mean, so we had sort of this, we didn't finish the discussion.
Yeah.
So let's ask you people behind you. You're from Korea, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're one of the countries that was actually influenced by China. But that happened through commerce or through war or through both? Probably both, right? When did you start to use Chinese characters?
Chinese character.
Yeah. Before you got Hangul, you had Chinese characters, right?
Yeah, before Qin Dynasty.
As old as that?
Yeah, yes, very old.
Really? So it's like
It's made from some teachers.
1000 before BC?
Yeah, yes.
Hmm. But at that time, the Chinese were not conquering you, right? So it must have been trade. Probably. So that's maybe a little counterexample, Carlos.
Yeah, but what we're thinking is that there are sort of different levels, because on one hand you have commerce and
Yeah.
tabulation.
Yeah.
Those are basically required for everybody. But then you have a higher form of rhetoric, maybe, you know, poetry, science,
Yeah.
things like that. That sort of, those sorts of writings would probably have been very restricted.
So when you see Chinese culture spreading to Japan, Qin Dynasty, that's actually
Yeah.
after this period. It's usually spread by monks. They spread it with Buddhism.
Yes.
It's
yes.
so. I think there are many ways. But anyway, what did you think about the similarities and differences between?
I think the similarity has a very similar political system about the king control.
Yeah.
But I think it's very different. In China, before Qin and Han Dynasty,
Yeah.
there are a lot of countries
Yes.
in China. It's
Yeah.
so many
After
countries.
the Han
Yeah,
Dynasty, there was the period of the warring states.
Yeah, that's right. The central region is very weak.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. But we stopped before that period, actually. Yeah. Okay, let's see. I have some points also. One thing I wanted to start with is this. Both in China and in the West, there was an idea of what the traditional arts were, if you wanted to be a well-educated person, or if you want to be, as they call them in China, mandarins, officials. So here's a traditional Chinese. You should be very good at ceremony, know how to do things with the emperor, etc. Different locations have different ceremonies. That's not part of the traditional Western one. Music, part of both. Archery, it's when you have bow, you have arrows and you shoot. Part of Chinese traditional ideas, not Western. Charioteering, which the Romans had, apparently disappeared in the West. So if you remember the medieval period in Europe, they were riding on horses with knights and they were using lances to hit each other, but not charioteering. This part of the Chinese. Writing, important in both. In the West, they even divided it then into grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, etc. So these things, part of the traditional medieval Western educational ideal. Grammar, rhetoric, dialectic. Mathematics in China and in the West. It was specialized to arithmetic very often. And in the West, we added astronomy. So but anyway, you can see there are three things in blue are similar between West and China, and the things in black are a little different. And what surprised me a little when I saw this list is that the Chinese actually had more of this, archery and charioteering. I had always thought that the Western were more into fighting.
They had chariots with archers on, which was very effective at warfare because they were very fast.
Yeah.
And so they used it for a couple of hundred years to a very large success in order to, conquer and keep other people at bay.
Right. Yeah.
So that's why, most likely. It's basically the same scale as a knight is if you think how much impact as knights in Europe, full armor.
But you wanted to say, yeah?
No, I was just thinking that why there are rhetorics and dialectic in traditional Western list, but not Chinese. And I was thinking that I was into that thread before, the relationship to the divine in China and in Mesopotamia, for example, is very different. As you said, in Mesopotamian cultures, you see men-like. The divine has men-like properties, while the Chinese doesn't have that. So that's why maybe there is a gap between the aristocrats that is a representation of the divine and their subordinates. Yes.
But in China, they talk about the son of heaven. That's the emperor.
Yeah, that's the emperor. Yes.
That's the emperor, but he's the.
That's
connection.
why he's unreachable.
He is the connection. So it's very autocratic.
Yeah.
In the West, we have a division between emperor and pope because they couldn't agree.
Yeah.
So they started to fight around the year 800 or so. And that means that the church and the state, to some extent, were separate, at least in Catholicism, from each other. So that I think is one difference. That religion was more integrated with the state in China than in the West.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about this thing about how abstract, what kind of view of God you have. I'm not even sure the Chinese had a view of God because they had Tao, they had other ideas, not exactly the same way. Okay, the style. Chinese they don't like to talk too much. It's not Latin style. they have brief style, and they have a lot of stuff which is implicit. So we talked about high context, okay? So they like to use archaistic. They have Chinese actually were the first to develop rhyme and parallel in sort of nice short poems. Qin Dynasty poetry is what later became Japanese haiku, but it's actually a Chinese invention from the beginning. And so there's a lot of stuff which is indirect, implicit, and that goes well with this idea that China is a high context culture. So you have to know a lot about the background to really understand what is being meant. There's quite a lot of stuff actually preserved, going quite far back now, 1,000 years before Christ. So there are some 100 formal speeches preserved, which these speeches are attributed to emperors or to officials and philosophers. One general feature of all of them is that it's nearly always conservative. They don't like big change. They like to preserve things as the way they have been. And that, if you can do things the way they've always been done, that's a good thing. But that's the same feature we find in Egypt, we find it in Mesopotamia. So it's a sort of, in all of these old empires, preservation of the old stuff is very good. So reaffirmation of social and political hierarchy, reinforcement of customs, tradition, consensus seeking, courtesy, you're supposed to be polite. You're not supposed to be impolite, you always have to be polite. Respect for authority, but you're supposed to be frank and sincere. That's not always so easy to combine these things. That could come into conflict with each other. And they like to imitate canonical texts. So if you can find a speech where an emperor spoke this way, then you should speak like that. That's good. So imitate what has gone before. Now it's up to you to think if some of this is still true of China. Okay. Here is the topics they take up. Qianming, mandate of heaven. So the son of heaven is the rule, that's the emperor. And this is accepted by virtually everyone. And the emperor is assisted by mandarins. And they are then people who've gone to a special kind of education where they have usually learned a lot of classics. They know how to speak in a good way and they know how to quote the classics, etc., etc. And this seems to have been a long tradition in China. As in Egypt, when people give advice to the emperor, it's often about restoring order to society, keeping up the old traditions, doing what you're supposed to do to keep the people happy. So the ruler should act wisely, justly, and compassionately. And if that happens, the people will be loyal and they will follow all rituals and traditions. That's seen as something very good. The only exception to all of this is Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. Then the Chinese tried to throw out of the window all of this, but it only lasted 15 years. Then they shut the window again. They started to go more this way. Yeah. So today, the Chinese Cultural Institute around the world is not called Chinese Cultural Institute. It's called what? It's called the Confucius Institute.
Yeah.
So that's clear. In the Cultural Revolution, Confucius was not popular. Now he's very popular again. Okay, very much of their thinking is modeled on family relations, especially father and son. And they have a lot of ideas about how those relations should work when they are ideal. And they are a model for the whole society. Types of rhetoric. Well, they have a lot of deliberative. Actually, in the old days, they used to discuss how to do things, so they had to try to convince the emperor, or the emperor has to convince other people. It was not always so autocratic, actually. And there's something called the Book of History that we'll come to, which is full of examples of this kind of rhetoric. Judicial. Well, they have a list of various kinds of punishments, and so that they give to people who have not behaved properly. So here you see death, branding, when you put, you know what that is, yeah. Cutting off the nose, cutting off the feet, castration. But you find this in many other cultures too, not only Chinese.
Yeah.
And they have various kinds of fees, I didn't list them here, that you can have to pay. And then they have milder errors. If you have done, not something which is as serious as for these punishments, they just call it error. And then they put you on a log, and you have to be, I don't know, everybody looks at you and you have to be ashamed. And you know this punishment? Yeah. And or you can be put on a big stone, and everybody again can look at you because you've been such a fool. Or they can be condemned to hard labor. So this is already several thousand years back. These two punishments are not so common in modern times. Or are they still common in China? Making people ashamed? No, you don't use that anymore.
No?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
How about in the classroom? If you have a student who misbehaves, can you command the teacher, tell him to sit in the corner?
Yeah,
So he has to be ashamed?
yeah, but some kids don't even care. But now it's sort of punishment, which is forbidden in China.
Now it's forbidden.
It's like it's not like you cannot stand in the end of the classroom. It's like if teacher punish student
Hit them.
yeah, it's not allowed.
Not allowed, but put them in the end of the classroom, still allowed.
It's okay.
Do they have to wear a special cap?
No, that's not that's
That's mocking.
oh, that's too much.
That's used to be. Have you heard about the dunce cap? Yeah, it was also in Western schools that if you have been, the teacher wanted you to feel ashamed, you had to sit in the corner with a special cap on. Okay, but advice is also given to those who can judge people that when in doubt, do not convict. No judgment when in doubt. In Chinese culture, there's also a lot of praise poetry. So you praise those who have power. And then sometimes there's a Chinese word called fu. Have you ever heard of this word? Fu. Yeah, I don't know the characters. I can't help you.
Fool maybe like fortune.
Yeah, maybe fool. I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's like luck.
Yeah, maybe. But it's supposed to mean kind of prose poems with a mixture of different styles in it.
Yeah.
Means of persuasion. Well, again, in Chinese culture, like in the other cultures, you get a lot of authority just by your position. Pathos. There's not so much pathos in Chinese speaking. There, you find it sometimes, and that is, in some periods they have a lot of wars against each other. For example, the period of the warring states and so on. So they have to try to make people willing to fight. Then you find some military generals or even emperor trying to get people angry to go and fight. So they do that by talking about the vices of the enemy. These people are so terrible, they have done this and this, so you have to kill them. Yeah. Logos, many inductive examples. They use precedents. Yeah, it's important to quote earlier work. Quotations and analogies. Structure of speech, proemium, that's a kind of introduction. Narratio, give the main message, then you give some reason, proof for that, and then you summarize. So this is a nice structure which you find in many Chinese speeches. Okay, meta-rhetoric. Remember we talked about the advent of writing gave rise to concepts about language and communication. You find that in China too. So, here are some old Chinese terms. Pian, to distinguish, that's very important when you do intellectual work. You want to distinguish between this and that. You don't recognize these words. They could be old Chinese. I don't know. And I'm not giving them the right tones probably. But it can also mean to argue. Can you recognize this?
Ah, it's beard, huh?
Yeah. Bin.
Beard.
Bin.
Beard.
Bien.
Yeah. It's like argue or distinguish the difference
Yeah.
between.
You know now.
Yeah, but
Recognize.
it's like we use our own pronunciation. It's like
Yeah.
B-I-A-N.
Yeah.
So that's why I cannot.
Or it's with B.
Yeah, it's B-I-A-N.
Bien.
B-I-A. Oh, so in pinyin is B-I-A-N. This
Yeah.
could be, I took this from the book, he could be using Wei Giles.
Yeah, I think so.
So he's not using pinyin perhaps. But you would write it B-I-A-N.
Yeah.
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 Okay. Yeah. Okay. And that's a problem, you know, there are many transcription systems for Chinese. And not everyone uses pinyin.
Yeah. In China, we all use this.
Yeah, I know.
But
I myself can use pinyin. I cannot really use this. I just took it from the book. Yeah.
Oh my god, I'm trying.
Sure must be the same, right? That's
Yes, that's
this is the same. And shui is the same also, to persuade.
No.
No?
Shui.
How do you write that?
Without E.
Sorry.
No, 是谓. Yeah.
Oh, it's just
水.
this? Shui.
But actually, 说 and 水 is the same character.
Same character.
Just different pronunciation.
Ooh, that makes it even more difficult.
But if you say in different pronunciation,
Yeah.
it means it's two different meaning.
Okay.
But it's the same character.
Yes, pronunciation.
A bit complicated.
Yeah, I know it's very complicated because sometimes you have the same pronunciation and many characters,
Yes.
and then you have one character still with many pronunciations.
Yeah.
Actually, not only
Yeah.
that's it.
Yeah.
I see it.
I know. Okay, now a lot of stuff in China is Confucius inspired, and this might be what is sort of traditional idea about rhetoric. So, emphasis on speaking to small group or to a leader, giving the leader advice on what to do. When you get, this is the Confucius traditional style. When you get to Buddhism, which is introduced into China maybe 400 AD or so, 200, 400, people dispute, during the time of the Warring States. They like to speak to bigger audiences, so then you get more rhetoric which has to do with talking to a bigger audience. But common to all of this is they like lively phrases, metaphor, comparisons, and they like to have sages, old emperors, etc. and you quote. That's a good thing. Here are some more meta rhetorical terms. So I don't know if this is not pinyin. So Li Tzu, you recognize that? Parallelism? No. Means that you have write same kind of words in two lines, following each other. P, metaphoric comparisons. Shi, I don't know, maybe with X in pinyin. Yeah, evocation. Yin Yang, allusion to earlier text. Yun Xing, historical allusion. Qi Chu, borrowing of earlier text. Huashi, hyperbole, that means that you exaggerate to make something much bigger.
花式.
You recognize it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like exaggerate.
Yeah. Exaggerate, exactly, yes. And here's this fu. However, it's, I don't know. This must probably be the same opinion.
Yeah.
So, poetic prose, creating voices of literary characters, often in praise of someone. Around 100 years before Christ, the first dictionary appears in China. And they also give advice on 4 kinds of bureaucratic petitions. Personal letters, essays, epigraphs, and then this praise poetry. Okay, let's now take a look at some Chinese important works which have remained in history. One of them is called the Book of Songs, written in this transcription system, Shi Qing. Do you know this?
诗经.
Yeah, you know it?
Yeah.
Okay. Probably not that H's could go away.
J-I-N-G.
Oh, J-I-N-G. Oh, Shi Jing. Okay.
And without H.
Okay. So anyway, it consists of 305 lyric and narrative poems. There are about many different topics: courtship, marriage, warriors and battle, agriculture, blessing, welcome, feasting, sacrifice, music, dancing, dynastic songs, building, hunting, moral. So all different topics are captured. And they are often in short verses, each line 4 words, and there's a lot of repetition and rhyme. And very often later studied and memorized. It's interesting to note that the Chinese were probably the first in the world who used rhymes systematically. You know what rhymes are? It's when the words end in the same way. So you have, on different lines, they end in the same way. Okay, another important piece of work for Chinese classical education and rhetoric is this Shuqing.
Shuqing.
Shuqing?
No, I don't know. I don't know.
This is history. This is history. You know that one too? Do you know it?
I'm not sure.
Okay, it's about kings from about 2200 BCE to 628 BCE. So more than almost 2,000 years. It's a chronology with 50 speeches by emperors, generals, and officials. It was a model for later speeches. And you have qualities like honesty, frankness, no personal attacks, no self-interest. You always try to look like you're speaking in the interest of everybody. And what you find here are exhortations from ruler to general or to troops. So we go to war, we should fight a just cause. Announcements from ruler to officials or people, and sometimes instructions for the minister to the ruler. Well, those are the sort of classical scenes of Chinese rhetoric. Another interesting Chinese book, which is similar to a Western book, is this book. It's about, it tells you about the lives of many historical figures. And so it's biographies of famous people. And as I wrote there, it's very similar to a book which exists in the West, which is called Lives by Plutarch. Have you ever heard of this book? Nobody? One person? Carlos has heard of it, of course. Good. So in this book, Plutarch captures the lives of, Julius Caesar, Octavian, etc., etc. Life after life is captured. Written more than 2,000 years ago. But in China, we find a similar book about well-known Chinese characters. So let's look now at the philosophical traditions in China. In China, usually they see logic and so on as a means for, it's not the goal in itself. The goal in itself you get from aphorisms, examples, parables, etc. And logic is used to try to show you the way to reach the goals which are given in those aphorisms. So the most, let's say, classical Chinese idea, which is still very important today, is Confucianism. And this is then attributed to, well, I don't know, do you spell it this way? Kongzi?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So he is then regarded as the editor of the books we just mentioned, the Shuqing and the Shuqing. Yeah. And he died 479 before Christ. He was a contemporary of Buddha, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and he died 10 years before Socrates was born. So that's why I was saying that this period, there were a lot of people who later on became very important in the cultures of the world. For some reason, they all lived around 500 BC.
In different parts of the world.
So Confucius, like Socrates, was very good at rhetoric, but he was, like Socrates, also against Chinese sophists. His major work is usually called the Analects. And it's very similar to Plato's dialogues. In the Analects, you find Confucius discussing with his disciples. So there are questions to Confucius which he is answering. It's very similar to the dialogues of Plato, actually. So I said it's usually called the Analects. In these Analects, Confucius defends authority. He thinks that writing is very important. And he likes maxims and epigrams, and he talks a lot about ethics. What is right, how you should act if you have virtue, etc. So if you compare that to Plato's dialogues, you have Socrates. He's not at all as positive to authority. Socrates is questioning authority, while Confucius is defending it. So that's a major difference. Socrates is skeptical of writing, while Confucius is positive to writing. Socrates likes irony, and he talks a lot about epistemology, but actually these two heroes are somewhat different in character. Here is a defender of virtue, of ethics, of tradition. Here's a guy who's trying to actually, question tradition.
Maybe he was also a defender of ethics in a way, but he didn't like the way the authorities seen ethics.
Right. But so he was not just defending ethics in the sense of tradition,
Yeah.
which is what you find here.
Yeah.
Right? Here you find it through conceptual analysis, through critical arguments. And then through that, this classical idea of debating, dialectics, you're supposed to find what is correct and right. Okay, so this is the first tradition, and maybe the most important tradition in China. And there are some important concepts in Confucianism. So Tao is also associated with another philosophical tradition that will come to Taoism, but it's also part of Confucianism. So the way. So this to some extent replaces ideas about God. You have to find the right way. So it's in a sense, more abstract. Then you have the concept of virtue, which I don't know how to pronounce.
Yeah.
And then you have Li, which is mostly ceremony, good manners. And then Yi, which is conduct fitting your status. So every person has a certain status, you should behave that way. And then you have Zhen, which means to be noble and civilized. So these are the things. So, you cultivate your character and you have all of these things, then you are the perfect, you're a good person in the sense of Confucius. That's what he wants to preach. And the rhetorical idea is the speaker should be wise, learned, sincere, moral, firm of purpose, and conciliatory. The speech should be restrained, clear, appropriate to the speaker and situation, and it should be practical. But Confucius also says you cannot speak the same way always. You have to adapt your message to the particular audience. So he shows also some awareness of class. Okay, let's look at some other philosophical traditions. Here is Mencius, who was a follower of Confucius but added some new things. He's not as important as Confucius, but is usually mentioned in Chinese philosophy. So he has the doctrine of multi-perspectivalism. That means that he recognizes that you can see many things from many perspectives. There's not just one single way to see something. Okay. He also, as distinct from Confucius, he believed in the goodness of man. While Confucius thought that man was both good and bad, Mencius had a more positive view. And he believed that history repeats itself. Okay, another kind of philosophy which is more traditional and you cannot really pin down to any particular philosopher is this Yin and Yang philosophy. That means that in Chinese thinking you often think that everything has its opposite. Things are balancing each other. In Western thinking you always like to get rid of all the opposites. You want a clear message with only one, it shouldn't be a thesis and its antithesis in the same message. But in Chinese thinking, they think that's the way it is. Things balance each other, and you have to have harmony between the aspects. So, speech is yang, silence is yin. And you should have both. Then, here is another Chinese philosophical. This one is important. I said Confucius is important, this is less important, this is also less important. This is Mozi. He preached universal love. And there was a school of philosophy following this. But he was also the only Chinese philosopher really who developed logic. So there is an indigenous development of logic in China, and it's called Moist logic. Then we come to Taoism, which is also very important to follow Chinese thinking. And Taoism, perhaps next to Confucianism, is, I would say, maybe the second most important. And here you have Lao Tzu. Have you heard of him? Tao Te Ching. This was right? Tao Te Ching, yeah. Yeah, so that, here I have Pinyin spelling also. Yes. That's because I read this myself, so I know what I'm talking about. This is, he preaches the way of Wu Wei. You know this? Say it?
Wu Wei.
Wu Wei.
Wu means I.
Yeah. Well, not here, I think.
No, it's wrong. Wu Wei. Wu Wei.
It's Wu, it's Wu, it's wrong. Yeah, it should be you here. I now
Yeah,
recognize it. This is a mistake. It should be Wu. You're right. Wu Wei. Yeah. And that means what shall I call it? The strategy of no action. Sometimes the best action is no action. And he preaches this a lot. That's Lao Tzu, the old philosopher. Lao means old. And then Changzi is another Taoist philosopher who has many interesting things to say. He had, for example, he talks about when he dreamt he was a butterfly and he couldn't remember if he was the butterfly or the person dreaming about the butterfly. Yeah. Okay, so here are some Taoist rhetorical principles. Deprecate means to downsize, talk negatively about, okay? Deprecate eloquence and honor silence. Deprecate argumentation. So Taoists don't like the argumentation really. Look inward for truths. Avoid willful critical thinking. Use spontaneous intuition. Rest assertions on time-honored authority. Well, this is very close to Confucius. Rely on ethos, sincerity, humility, goodness, respectfulness, and trustworthiness. This is also close to Confucius. So here this would be common to Taoists and Confucius.
The first four ones
Are more Taoist originals.
Yeah, it's very Jantelagen, I would say.
Jantelagen?
Yes. Don't argument and honor silence, and you don't have to always.
But this one should be look inward for truth. It's not Jantelagen.
No, that's.
This is much more kind of mysticism of some sort.
But avoid willful critical thinking.
Okay, there is more Chinese traditions. China has a rich philosophical. So there's also a sophist tradition. Yangchu, I don't know what it would be. But they talk a lot about human nature, and they believe that judgments are based on self-interest. So but Confucius argues against these people. So here is this word in pinyin, right, that you were looking before, right? This is bian. Yeah. Dialectical disputation and bianzhi. I don't know.
Yeah.
Person who disputes dialectically. So they are people like that, and Confucius is sometimes talking against them. Okay, and they are interested in contests where you have a winner and a loser, and if you win, you leave your opponent with an answer, without an answer. And you're supposed to use shou, which is an explanation, and they have a concept of shui, which is persuasion of an audience. They appeal to emotions, to enlighten self-interest, idiosyncratic desires. They stress dress and demeanor, and they ingratiate often with their audience, so they give their audience compliments. This is sometimes a way to win the audience. Okay, then there's a very strange Chinese philosophical tradition, which is sometimes called the School of Names. Have you heard of this, Chinese people? No? But it's a very strange tradition, I would say. There's a philosopher called Kun Sun Lung, who has, he talks about the white horse. Have you heard about this? Bai Ma? Yeah, heard about it? So he says that a white horse is not a horse. And why not? Because horse is the name of a shape, and white is the name of a color. And so, it's not a horse. It's the name of a shape and a color. This gets this man to something close to the Platonic doctrine of abstract ideas outside of time and space. But it's what shall I call it? Not exactly the same philosophy as Plato's, but it's the Chinese philosophy which is closest to Plato, you might say. And so they talk a lot about what's in a name and why there can be correct and incorrect names. Usually we think that names cannot be correct or incorrect. But this guy thinks that names can be correct or incorrect. So, for example, if you have a Swedish person who's called, I don't know what, Granström, you know what this means? Fir brook. Gran is a tree, and Ström means brook. So then, if you follow this, you should look at this person. Is there something about this name which describes that person? Is it the correct name for that person? To us in the West, I think that question is sort of meaningless. But here, they thought that that was important. Everything should have its correct name. And so, if you get the correct name, and this leads to giving definitions, of course. So you can see if you've captured whatever is supposed to be captured by the name. So I said this is maybe the most strange of the Chinese schools of philosophy. It's the school which is most different from the West. Okay, finally, this is the last one, legalism. Usually in Chinese tradition, they're not so, let's say, interested in having laws. Because of Confucius, the idea was that you have a gentleman or a gentlewoman who had been cultivating their sense of virtue. And if you had a just and right ruler, you don't need any laws, because then they will look to their own virtues and they will make the right decisions. Okay, so normally that has been the Chinese position, and you can see that even today, because the legal system in China is weak compared to the West. Because there has never been any great stress on law in China. Okay, except for this school. They started to stress it a lot more than everyone else. But the way they did it was perhaps not the best way. So what they tried to do was to replace traditional norms or virtuous conduct, that is Confucius, virtuous conduct, by unquestioned acceptance of the law as laid down by the ruler. So if the emperor says do this and writes it down, you have to follow it exactly. That's legalism. This leads to a kind of power politics. And it leads to the leading philosopher here being sort of like the philosopher Machiavelli, who was very popular in Italy in the 1500s. Okay, so here is his advice. This is where we will end today. He tells this, if you compare this to what Machiavelli writes, it's not so different, right? So he advises them, trust no one. Hide your desires and motives. Avoid direct contact with the people. Create a sense of awe and mystery around your person. Take credit for all accomplishments and put blame for errors on others.
Die early of cancer.
This kind of advice is very different from what you would see if Confucius was writing it. And Confucius would not like this at all, because this is not virtue. This is a different kind of style, right? So therefore, this school of legalism has had a kind of bad name in China, I think, and people have not really liked it. So it's never become very popular, as far as I know. So there are three schools which have never become all that popular. There's the Moist school, actually four. The correctness of names, the Moist school, the Legalist school, and then the Mencius. All those four are somewhat minority. Well, the big ones are Confucius, Taoism, Yin and Yang Philosophy, and I don't know if I said, there must be one more. Let's see. No, maybe those are the most important ones, yeah. Taoism, Yin Yang, and Confucius. Those. And then later on, we should have added, but that's after this period, Buddhism. Buddhism comes in. That becomes very important in China too. So Chinese culture in general is, I think, is a mixture of Confucius, Yin Yang, Taoism, Buddhism, and of course, in the last 100 years, a little communism and Christianity. And then you mix, you get Chinese culture to some extent. There are other influences too.
Which one would you say is dominant, though?
In China,
Yeah, is it Confucianism?
I think Confucius still. And maybe second most important is Buddhism. Probably. Buddhism.
Yeah.
Foha.
佛号
Isn't it called for
佛教
Forja? Forja. Forja. Yeah, that's what I had to say about Near East and China. Next time we'll continue, persevere. We'll go through to India and maybe we'll get to Greece. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.